Well, bonjour. Je m'appelle Tyler Wittman, and I apologize that what little French I used to know from my school days in Spain is gone. But yes, I teach theology in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the very south of the United States. And yeah, I co-wrote this book with my friend Bobby Jamieson. Yeah, one of the key rules that we get from Scripture, again, these aren't rules that we are bringing to Scripture, they're rules that we are extracting from Scripture. They're already within Scripture. But one of the rules that we get from it is what some scholars are calling partitive exegesis. And essentially, it's a way of reading the various things that Scripture says about Jesus by keeping in mind that the reason Scripture says these things, the way that Scripture speaks, is because Jesus is both fully God and fully man. And so sometimes Scripture will say things about Jesus that it can only say because he's fully man, like he's less than the Father, that he came not to do his own will, but the will of him who sent me, right? He says these kinds of things. At the same time, we find also really strange things that Jesus will say, or that Scripture says about him, where it's clearly obvious the only reason that it can speak that way about Jesus is because Jesus is also fully God. He's both at the same time. He doesn't transition from being fully God to then being fully man. He's both. He becomes fully man without ceasing to be fully God. And so, in this way, Peter can talk about God redeeming the world by his blood, right? We speak about Jesus as God who sheds his blood. Well, how does he shed blood? Because he's a man. And so, what we end up seeing is that there are basically two reasons that Scripture can speak about one person, Jesus, with all these various ways, right? A divine reason and a human reason, right? A divine nature and a human nature. And so, you see this in Philippians 2, where Paul talks about Jesus being in the form of God, being equal with God, and not considering equality with God something to be used to his own advantage or exploited. And then he talks about Jesus taking on, right, the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of human flesh, right, becoming obedient, um, dying, right, a death on a cross. And so those are kinds of things that you can only say of someone who is a man, someone who is less than God. How is he less than God? As a man, not as God. And so partitive exegesis is basically exegesis that keeps in mind that we have, when we're talking about Jesus, we have to do with someone who is fully God and fully man. And so at the heart of one of our biggest chapters in the book is exploring the many different ways that Scripture encourages us to think this way and to read the Bible this way, but also the ways that that helps us actually dig deeper into Scripture, see what Scripture is saying to us, and not be confused or misdirected by statements that would, if they were applied to any just normal human being, would be contradictory. So an example of this would be from John chapter 5, which the final chapter of our book is an extended exegesis of John chapter 5, looking at how all the different rules that we put together many rules, not just about partitive exegesis, but also about the Trinity and so forth. And we show how they help you dig into John 5. Well, an example of this partitive exegesis bit from John 5 is in verse 27, where Jesus says that the Father he's speaking here, just as Jesus speaking. He says, speaking of the Father, he has given the Son of Man, him, authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. And Jesus is saying the Father has given the Son of Man, authority to execute judgment. At the same time, he's also already said that the Son himself, that the Father has given the Son all judgment, that the Son judges no one by himself, and so forth. So, how do we put all this together? Well, what you end up looking at, or you end up seeing if you look back at the Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, and elsewhere, is that this Son of Man designation is a title for a specific office, that a set of duties, a job description, as it were. And it's something that the Son of God himself takes on in his humanity. And so how does the Son receive authority from the Father? Well, this doesn't point us back to some eternal relationship in which the Father eternally gives an authority to the Son that the Son doesn't have. This refers to an authority, a granting of authority that takes place in time, as the man Jesus is given authority as a man to execute judgment. All right. And so he's given an authority that somehow rhymes with his eternal divine authority that he has with the Father. The Father and the Son, as God, don't have different authorities. They all have the one authority that belongs to the one God, because they both are God. They're distinct persons, but they're one God. So here in time, as we're looking, and we see that he doesn't do anything from himself, but only what he sees the Father doing, right? Or only what the Father tells him to do. He is given authority and so forth. Well, these things refer us to actions that he's undertaking as a man. And if they point us back to anything eternally, they're just pointing us back to those relations that exist within the Trinity, where the Son exists from the Father, the Spirit exists from the Father and the Son. Whereas another example would be when Jesus says, I came not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. Well, what sense does that make, right? You either can read that as two gods, right? Kind of vying for whose will is going to win out in the situation, who's going to do whose will. Or you see it as, well, no, this is the second Adam who has to obey where we disobeyed in Adam. And so he has to render a human obedience for our salvation. And so he is rendering that human obedience because he has a human nature. And so he has not only a human will, but he also has a divine will. So his divine will is one with the Father, but his human will, that's distinct, right? Because the Father doesn't have a human will, the Spirit doesn't have a human will. And so when we see these situations in light of Christ's two natures, they actually end up making more sense and they take us deeper into the text. Man, that's a great question. Pray that that the Lord's work here in New Orleans, where I am, continues. This is a city that has a lot of need and a lot of opportunity, a lot of beauty, and a lot of ugliness. And so, just pray that the Lord's grace shines here in New Orleans through the work of the school where I serve, New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, and pray for my own teaching and my own writing and research as I try to, explore deep things and bring forth, fresh fruit for the saints. So those are ways you can pray for me.